On the morning of November 17, 2006, Carlos, an 11th grader at Wadley High School in Manhattan and vice president of the School Government Association, was arrested outside his school and taken to a jail cell. His crime, according to the police officer who brought him in, was being a smart aleck. Carlos wasn't the only one arrested at Wadley that day. The New York Police Department had just installed metal detectors and was conducting random searches as part of a new city policy to eliminate weapons in schools. In theory, a good policy, but it was implemented in a way that turned out to be needlessly provocative. Students were curse-tagged and threatened with arrest if they refused to comply with the search or turn over their cell phones. Carlos didn't want to hand over his cell phone. An excellent student who worked 30 to 40 hours each week after school, he needed to be in frequent touch with his mother. So he chose to remain outside, where he called his mother and asked her to pick up the phone. When a cop asked for his ID, Carlos said he was waiting for his mom. "What are we going to do with this smart aleck?" the officer said to his fellow cop. The reply, "Take him to the precinct." Carlos was handcuffed. His cell phone was seized. The next thing he knew, he was in a police car heading for the local precinct, where he was ordered to remove his belt and shoelaces and put into a holding cell. To make matters worse, before he was finally released, he got a summons, warning that if he did not appear in court, a warrant would be issued for his arrest. The charges were ultimately dropped. Carlos was lucky. A court record would have changed this A student's life forever. His chances of getting a good job would have been diminished. Carlos's story comes from the pages of a 2007 report from the New York Civil Liberties Union on the over-policing of New York schools. But what happened to Carlos that morning 7 years ago was not, unfortunately, an aberration. Some version of this scenario continues to happen in New York schools every day. Next Tuesday, more than 1 million New York City kids head back to the classroom for the start of a new school year. It's always been a time when everything seems fresh and hopeful, but for some kids this year, the school system won't be a passport to an exciting future. It will be a vehicle that steers them into the criminal justice system. Last year, more than 70,000 students were suspended. Most of the suspensions were for relatively minor disciplinary issues, like talking back to a teacher or disrupting a class. Such behavior once landed you in the principal's office. Today, it can earn you a police summons. Children who find themselves in that situation are more likely to drop out and 7 times more likely to end up in juvenile court, at the start of a pipeline that will end in prison. That figure comes from a startling report released last spring by a task force comprised of the city's most prominent educators and juvenile justice advocates. The School Justice Partnership Task Force found that the number of suspensions in New York public schools has increased by almost 40% in just 6 years. More tragically, it found that Black and Latino students were disproportionately affected. So as a new school year and an election year begins, there's no better moment to ask whether we can reform the tough school disciplinary policies that are ruining so many young lives before they even start, and whether we can break what some have called the school-to-prison pipeline. To begin that conversation, we're honored to have as our guest former New York State Chief Judge Judith Kaye, who chaired the task force. Judge Kaye, welcome to Criminal Justice Matters.
Thank you.
Honored to have you here.
Delighted to be here.
Let's begin with your report itself. What led to the task force being formed 2 years ago? What were the driving factors?
This is a long story, Steve. I left as chief judge. There's mandatory retirement from the state court system, and that was back in 2009 when I joined Skadden Arps, the law firm that told me I could do whatever my heart impelled me to do, and I knew that would take me immediately to something involving kids. Had a forum on the school to prison pipeline, or some people call it cradle to prison pipeline, which led eventually to a nationwide summit where we brought educators and judges together. This has been my passion for a very, very long time. I've watched education move up in national consciousness, move up in the headlines, and it seems to me that we have just the right moment to bring people together. Judges are great conveners. If nothing else, they are great conveners. And so I have decided to use my credential as former chief judge, forever advocate for juvenile justice and justice generally, to move forward with this idea of pursuing the school to prison pipeline, deleting it, removing it, devastating it. The national summit led to a state summit, led to this totally fabulous task force, this most amazing task force. Everyone I invited accepted. And if you study our report, which was officially released right here at John Jay on May 30, if you study our report, you'll see that we convened approximately 3 dozen meetings over a period of 2 years. These people were utterly fantastic. They were judges, they were educators, they are just the leading lights of every community.
The findings, though, were nothing short of shocking. I mean, they were really disappointing to discover how much had gone wrong in the system.
Well, in a sense, shocking. In a sense, I think my grandmother could have told you a lot of this. I'm very happy that we've arrived at a point where we have data that was not previously publicly available. The data confirms what good sense tells us. Good sense tells us that when kids are dropped out of school, busted out of school, expelled, when they're arrested, they're not necessarily on a pathway to a happy, constructive, productive life. I said, my grandmother could have told you that. But fortunately, over the years, we've been getting access to data that was never before publicly available. And I now say data, 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 ching, ching, ching. When you have data, you can really put money and good thinking and good people behind what makes good sense.
And the data tells us what? What happens
The
to these
data
kids?
tells us that when kids are dropped out of school, when they're arrested and have records that will follow them, that we are growing the next generation of violent criminals. Overwhelmingly, the data shows us that we were able to track suspensions for the first time. We never really had access to that data. To learn for the school year 2012, for example, which was the last data we had available, that there were 70,000 suspensions from the New York City public schools. Totally shocking. Now, a suspension can be a superintendent suspension, the more serious kind of suspension, which can be up to a year. It can be a principal suspension, the less serious kind of suspension.
And all for offenses that would not have caused anybody to blink an eye maybe 20 years ago.
Absolutely. Now, there are some serious ones, of course. I say some of them. Kids have serious problems, but overwhelmingly, I've known you a long time. I know you're a very good person, but I doubt that there's anything on the list that you didn't do when you were an adolescent. Horseplay.
I would hate to admit it, but you're probably right.
I'm confident about that. You know, horseplay and talking back to somebody, and you know, having a scuffle with your friend, that kind of thing. And it's incidents like that we found were overwhelmingly leading to these, what we call discretionary suspensions, principal suspensions. You know, something goes a little amiss in a school and you suddenly call the school safety agent, or the cops, you've got a ticket, which or which we call a summons in our court system, or you've got an arrest, or you've got a suspension. The kid is out of school.
We created this system, I guess, in some ways for honest reasons. We were worried about disruption in the schools. I mean, there was a point in the 80s or the 90s when people were talking about super predators, kids, that there was a real problem with juvenile delinquency. To use an even older word. Were we wrong? I mean, was this just the wrong way to go? Was this tough love kind of policy?
Well, we live and learn is my simple answer to what you're saying. And I've heard, there's so much around about candidates today, and I've heard at least one of the candidates say, you've got to get the bad kids out. And I think that was the thinking. And a lot of people still think that. I've heard that. You've got to get the bad kids out. But let's pause for a moment and ask ourselves, who are these quote unquote bad kids we're getting out? The kids that we're suspending and arresting and giving tickets to. Who are the bad kids we're getting out? And then we have to ask ourselves the second inherent question. It goes absolutely immutably with the first one is, where are we getting them out to? To the streets? To juvenile detention? To prison? Is that so? Just the idea that our instinctive reaction was we've got to get the bad kids out, which is what you're describing, was a thinking that probably could be encapsulated in this zero tolerance. Yes. I hate to use that phrase, although I know a lot of people. It does, but then there's so much resistance to that, and especially in the city of New York, where there has been so much wonderful attention to education and so much absolutely terrific reform, and everybody will say, well, we're not zero tolerance discipline, and absolutely, I would agree with that. We've moved away from that. But at its heart, we're talking about, quote unquote, getting the bad kids out to keep the school safe. And we got to think harder about that.
The task force report came out the end of May, just as the mayor's campaign was starting to wind up, get into full gear. Now we've got 4 months of a campaign. There were 2 mayoral candidates, if I remember, at the rollout, the launch. Has there been any traction? Do you see any result without favoring one candidate or the other? But are our candidates for mayor for the next administration, do they seem like they're willing to act and respond to the recommendations that you made?
I would say, first of all, as you know, the report was specifically timed to be put in the hands of the mayoral candidates and to raise consciousness to this indubitably important issue, vital issue to the city of New York. And we wanted every candidate to have that report. And a couple of them have specifically responded. In fact, one of them has gone further and issued his own report just in the month of July, coming pretty much to our conclusions too, with even more data, because now we're in a time where we can get more data. But I think I would answer your question affirmatively that all of the candidates have seen and are impressed by our report, because education is a vital part of every single conversation. And I know we're going to work well with the next mayor, and it's important that we do so.
That's very encouraging.
Well, I am. You cannot be the chief judge of the state of New York, as was my good fortune for more than 15 years, without heart and soul being an optimist, believing that you can make this a better world, believing that you can bring about change that is vital, important, and nowhere, Steve, nowhere is it more important that we bring about a change than in our attitude toward quote unquote bad kids in school. We got to find ways, we've got to take a pause before we condemn a so-called bad kid to a life of violent crime. And we can do it.
Judge Kaye, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
One of the most compelling findings of the task force was that the high rates of suspensions and arrests are limited to a small number of schools, which is encouraging in one sense. It seems to make it easier for education reformers to zero in on specific disciplinary approaches that have led to such unequal outcomes. But it also raises harder questions about the extent to which the ambitious education reforms of past decades in New York have been sidetracked, not to mention about how our juvenile justice system itself has contributed to making the school-to-prison pipeline a sad reality for so many New York kids. To help us explore those questions, we've invited Judge Monica Drinane, supervising judge of the Bronx County Family Court, and Timothy Lisante, superintendent of District 79, which operates alternative programs for New York City Department of Education. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Great to have you with us.
Here.
Good to be here.
So, Judge Drinane, let me start with you. You've seen the results, so to speak, of our zero tolerance policies in your courtroom. And nothing could be more vivid than seeing the failures of those policies. Tell us a little bit about what you've seen come before you on the bench.
Well, what you often see are cases that come in where I would think as a former teacher, could have been handled within a school setting, but oftentimes the charges could be something like obstructing governmental administration or resisting arrest, and it may really evolve out of a situation where a youngster in a school setting gets into an altercation or dispute with a school safety officer. And depending on the skills of the school safety officer, that matter either gets de-escalated or escalated.
But it gets to be ridiculous, doesn't some of the cases that have come before you are
yes, because
absurd in a sense. In terms of...
that you have recently, I just have had one case which I call the cupcake case, because it was an incident of two youngsters on a line. There was a cupcake sale in the cafeteria, and one boy takes out his single dollars, and the youngster behind him grabs the money from him. Happens to turn out that they've always been very good friends, and he runs away with the money. The kid who was buying the cupcake runs after him. He grabs the other kid's hoodie. That youngster falls down. They get into a tussle, and the next thing that you know, they're facing charges in my courtroom. And my question is always...
Charges of what? What were they charged with?
Well, the youngster who's called the respondent was charged with assault, because during that tussle he did, and he acknowledged, he did hit the kid who was trying to grab back his money, but he was also in the process of trying to give the kid back his money. And so you have that situation where you have these two youngsters, and in a school system where I think the principal would have preferred to handle this through mediation and getting one youngster to apologize to the other youngster. But because there was a perception that there was a zero tolerance policy and that the school safety officer wanted to press charges, the case ends up coming into court, and lo and behold, both of these youngsters are missing school time. And by the time they get to my courtroom, they have again become best friends again and are really no longer interested in prosecuting this. So there's been an enormous waste of time in something that could have been settled quickly within a school
and how
system.
Old were they?
They were both 13-year-olds.
13-year-old.
And in many, I think anybody who's taught in a public school will tell you these kinds of incidents in the cafeteria happen all the time.
I was no angel myself.
And it's often the role of the teacher. I can myself remember kind of going to stand between two youngsters who were about to get into it and trying to deflect that. And that is the role, and oftentimes I think what the educators would prefer to be doing. But if you have an overlay of a system that says zero tolerance and everything has to move from the school setting to the court setting, then we're not really benefiting anybody, and we're often putting youngsters on a road of reinforcing negative behavior rather than moving quickly to get it on a more positive. So what did you do?
How did you resolve this in court? Did you just throw a thing out of court?
No, what I did was I ended up getting both sides to agree that they would go to mediation, and that the youngster who had instigated or started the incident would write a letter of apology to his friend. And I strongly suggested that the school find something that they could work on together, which the school in this case did.
Now, what happens when that doesn't work, when there's not an understanding judge like you? What ends up, those kids will end up in...
Well, they could end up...
the justice system.
They'll end up in the criminal justice system. They could end up in detention, which means they are then associating with negative peers rather than positive peers. Right. And they also get labeled. And once a youngster gets labeled, then a reoccurrence automatically means that rather than just being either a typical adolescent or a somewhat disruptive student, that youngster gets labeled as a bad kid. And then there is often a tendency to want to either push him out of the school system or to bring all of his incidents to court, because there's a sense that court will be what will keep this youngster in control.
There is an escape valve right now in the system, that we do have an alternative system for some of the kids that I guess catches them in a way before they go further into the school to prison pipeline. Is that right, Tim? I mean, you're the superintendent of District 79. Tell us a little bit about what the alternative districts are meant to do.
Well, one of the neat things is District 79 has been around for 30 years. It was the first alternative school district in the country. And in 1983, the dropout rate started to rise, and New York City, to its credit, responded with opening an alternative school division. And what we have now are 10 principals. Each one has multi-sites underneath them. So we have 163 sites throughout New York City. But basically, it's for older students. Students, for example, we have referral centers in each borough. And this year, over 9,000 students walked into our referral centers. And these were students that couldn't decide if they're going to continue with a high school diploma or go the equivalency route, GED. So basically, out of the 9,000, there's probably 9,000 different reasons why they came to us.
But by the time you get them,
yeah,
in a sense, it's already too late.
Yeah.
I mean, they've already been through disciplinary problems in the system.
Right.
They could be headed down a really bad path, but
yes,
you're kind of their last hope.
Yes. And matter of fact, in our division, we had 35% of the students that came into the referral center already had a discharge code from the Department of Education, which means they already dropped out of school, found out there's nothing for them in the community, so they're coming back to us. So it's a dropout recovery program. So you're right. We really deal with older students, average age is like 19. But the bottom line is they've had an unfulfilled high school experience.
This wasn't what school reform was intended to do when the ideas were first developed decades ago. Right? Yeah. They were supposed to develop not to be a holding pattern for kids who would just end up in the trash can if nobody helped them. Yeah. I mean, have we been sidetracked in some ways where we should have been because of these zero tolerance policies?
Well, I think this is I'm going into my 36th year in the public school system. I started as a special ed teacher in the 70s, and I've seen the pendulum, at least in alternative, swing. You know, we were, some people were giving away credits and there wasn't academic rigor, and then it swung way over here to all about academic rigor. And I think we need to be balanced between youth development and the academics. I think part of in the school reform that's been left out is the counseling piece, the social emotional learning piece, and we have to integrate that more as we accelerate the school reform moving forward.
Do both of you think that this partnership task force recommendations will get us on that path, or do we need more than that? I mean, what's really necessary to make these things reality?
No, I think one of the things that's really critically important about the recommendations is the underlying recognition that once a youngster is suspended, that the likelihood that there will be further suspensions increases dramatically, and ultimately the likelihood that that youngster will drop out of school increases dramatically. So what I think is one of the critical recommendations in the report, after much study and really looking at the underlying causes, is that school systems have to have a graduated response to disciplinary problems, and that, as Tim was saying, you know, that pendulum swing, we have to get it more balanced in the middle. No one is saying that, you know, youngsters should be let to run amok in a school setting. Nobody wants that. As a former teacher, I don't want that. But the reality is that you have to have an educated workforce working with these youngsters, and also a perception that youngsters who are exhibiting typical adolescent behavior shouldn't be labeled or categorized as bad students, bad people. Right. And that a school system has to be able to respond in a way that is helping to educate the youngster to think about their behavior.
So, quick question to both of you. Is reform possible, or is it too late in New York City at this point?
Absolutely possible.
Yes, and I think we should
we need to do.
Yes, and we shouldn't be stepping on the brakes. We should be stepping on the accelerator, continue the good reform movements, but extend them as into the new administration.
Thanks for both of you.
Thank you.
Our pleasure.
There's a quote in the school justice report that's worth thinking about. It comes from Frederick Douglass, the 19th century civil rights leader, educator, and former slave. He said, "It's easier to build strong children than to repair broken men." Let's hope our next mayor and Board of Education chief not only hang that quote somewhere in their offices, but follow through on it. For those of you with kids starting school next week, we wish them and you a successful and happy year. I'm Steve Hadelman. Thank you for watching. See you next time.